Caterina to join us. Caterina, as I said, has been working on art and politics. Would you like to stay here? Okay. And actually, very recently, 2 weeks ago, Caterina organized a big conference in the political science department dealing with what she calls the state artist. So the relationship between the official artists in the communist times and the artists that were more or less formalized in that system. But today, she made a special presentation for this event, and it's how the national and ethnic identities are represented in the Bucharest public space. Caterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juana, and thank you, Andrea, also for organizing this meeting and for inviting me. So I must start by saying that I'm not a specialist in diasporas or in either of the communities. And what mostly interests me is how the public space is organized by the state, but also by private actors and especially by artists. So how do artists relate to the public space? Usually in a logic of contestation is the main focus of my research. But thinking about the topic of this meeting, and a little bit about how Romania and Bucharest was more ethnically diverse at the beginning of the 20th century. I included some images from the beginning of the 20th century representing the Armenian community, the Jewish quarter, and the Roma. I studied a little bit more the formation of the Roma identity through art in the 19th century and the 20th century. We came to the period that follows 1990 to a much more homogenic and uniformized public space, which goes together with the transformation of Romanian society during communism. And in fact, despite the ethnic, so my main point today is that despite this ethnic diversity that still characterizes Romania after 1990, although all the numbers have fallen concerning all the minorities that exist in Romania, the public space, and especially in Bucharest, is mainly dominated by national values that are put forward and uniformization of different communities. But in the same time, in the years 2000, we see different types of artistic interventions that disrupt this view. So I'm going to argue that the artists help us understand our public space in a much more open and diverse way. And I'm going to show you examples. To begin with, I think the public space has been theorized as being open to everybody, but in fact more are marginalized or excluded from this public space, and not only in Bucharest, but in the new cities all throughout the world. Monuments have been the focus, the main focus, because they commemorate national history while forgetting or letting aside other types of histories. And the main question in this sense has been how to build an inclusive public space of democracy, how to bring in all these lost histories of the different communities. And so public spaces are broadly defined as crossroads, where different paths and trajectories meet, sometimes overlapping, and other times colliding, as we shall also see in a few moments. So they are a meeting place of politics and culture, social and individual territories, instrumental and expressive concerns. And in fact, again, one of the questions that arises is which narrative of the past is a city choosing to embrace after a period as the one that Bucharest experienced and Romania, that of the communist regime. And looking at this, I thought about the logics of representation in the Bucharest public space And as I already mentioned, although Romania has 10% of its population that belongs to different minorities, the percentage is a little bit higher in Bucharest, 14%. And although the numbers for each community have fallen, there are still Armenians, Jewish, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Roma, of course, Greeks, and new minorities that came about. The Chinese, for example, are also present in Bucharest in the last decade or so. So there is this diversity, but if we look at the politics of the construction of the public space, we are confronted with this uniformization of the values that are put forward, and this is seen in many ways. But at the same time, what arises when we look at the way the public space in Bucharest is organized is this competition of memories, or fight for a memory of the dominant community and of the other communities. And this also comes about in artistic forms, in the new forms of artistic intervention in the city. I quoted some examples concerning the almost absences of the traumas that marked the three communities to which I mainly refer in my presentation, the Armenian, the Jewish, and the Roma. You see that there are recent initiatives that try to tackle each community's trauma. So the Holocaust Memorial, which is a recently inaugurated memorial in 2009, but also a memorial for the Holocaust of the Roma, which is part of the Museum of the Culture of the Roma, which has been an ongoing project, we could say, because it was opened in 2013, but it's still, in fact, being formed nowadays. But they had this gesture, this symbolic gesture of marking the memory of the genocide of the Roma. And at the same time, in the public space and in the new artistic forms of intervention, we see this contestation of this reality of the genocides. And the best example to see this is the case of Ion Antonescu. Again, trying to prepare this presentation, I was curious to look a little bit at the monuments we have in Bucharest and the other symbolic representations, such as the names of the streets and of the public squares and so on. And in fact, in 2002, 25 streets in Romania, not only in Bucharest, had the name of Ion Antonescu, who was responsible for the Jewish and Roma genocide in Romania. And in 2001, a bust, so just his torso, was inaugurated in a church he established, in fact. And then the government was a little bit forced to adapt in 2002 a decision which forbids any fascist or xenophobic displays, and also the denial of the Holocaust, the naming of streets with people, with the names of people that participated to the crimes. And so the first solution was to cover Antonescu, as you can see in the picture, but then they put him in the basement of the church, and he is still there. And you need a special permit to photograph Antonescu from the Orthodox Church today. So he's still there, but not displayed as a symbol of the greatness of Romania. And this collides with this other memory, which also exists in Bucharest, the monument for the pogrom of 1941, which was inaugurated this year, and the Holocaust Memorial. And so we have this collusion of memories in the public space, which is interesting. And again, artistic critique through urban interventions, as I will show you. Hopefully I will not talk too much and have time to show you everything. And so if we look at the way the monuments are built in the organization of the public space in Bucharest, and this is an important element to take into account when discussing this transformation of a society after a dictatorship or another form of traumatism, historical traumatism. As Catherine Verdery mentioned in her book, The Life of Dead Political Bodies, the change of the political regime can be seen at the symbolic level in the change of the men of bronze, as she calls the statues. And so we have this transformation also of the symbols that occupy the public space in Bucharest. And again, if you take a look at the list of figures that are represented, you discover that it's mainly Romanian men, so mainly men, I emphasize men, with very few exceptions. So very few Romanian women are represented, and of over the 80 monuments in Bucharest, 1/4 are representing other ethnicities, but not the communities that exist in Bucharest, but like famous writers or famous heroes of independence in South America, for example, which is interesting for me, but not so useful, let's say, for the building of a more inclusive public space in Bucharest. And then streets and public squares are even more blatantly Romanian inspired. Of the 4,800 streets, less than 1% are inspired by foreign personalities or other ethnicities. So it's this preference given to neutral or very unimportant words of the dictionary. There's this preference to this kind of streets and not to personalities of other communities. And you can see this also, as I was saying, at the level of architecture. You have the national museums of history, national museum of art. This emphasis is always present. And this, despite the existence in the Bucharest public space of other cultural landmarks, which belong to, most importantly, to the Jewish and Armenian communities, because the Roma have been marginalized and continue to be marginalized in Romanian society, and so there is no emphasis on this community. But we have several institutions that deal with them, the religious and the cultural organization of the Jewish and Armenian communities. I mentioned some there. Just some images. So this is the overtly men statuary of Bucharest. Only very famous leaders like Cuza, Mihai Viteazu, Bălcescu, and poets like Eminescu. These are the landmarks that are repeated instead of bringing diversity. And some of the foreigners, we have very unexpected and contradicting, let's say, figures from De Gaulle to Bolivar, Atatürk, Aliyev, Dubček, and Napoleon III. So there are several reasons for the inclusion of this kind of public representation. And some of the images of the cultural centers of the other communities. But then what I want to emphasize is how artistic representations try to disrupt this logic in very different ways. Since the 2000s, most importantly, urban art has developed, and it takes several forms, from stencil graffiti, which is the easiest way to transmit a message, to graffitis, but also paintings, stickers, and all sorts of transformations of buildings, the sidewalk, or everything that surrounds us. And there are different messages that are put forward. It's mainly a politically inspired social critique means to disrupt this daily existence that we have in nowadays cities, but it is also it has also become gradually taken over by a commercial a commercial promotion of different products, and also very decorative, without any message. And in this sense, I chose a little bit of images that we have. It all started in 1989 when it became possible to write on the walls. People were writing on the walls even before 1989, but the Securitate and the milice, the police of the time, made sure nobody saw that. So they erased rapidly whatever came during the night, or I don't know. But in 1989 it became possible to write on the walls, and people wrote Ceausescu and his wife, "We don't want you in Romania." It's one of the messages. Besides, we want freedom, we want food, and stuff like that. But then increasingly the public space became dominated by something that is today valid, that is this presence of the parties that cover buildings, and they take all sorts of forms. I chose some more funny messages by the candidates. For example, the one on the right is called mute. The mute says, "Call me and talk to me," and he's a candidate. And so a little bit funnier, but the thing is that this electoral presence is dominating and takes over everything, and so it's comparable to the commercial covering of the buildings, for example, in Bucharest. Then in special moments we have this memory of '89 that comes about, especially in December. You see messages recalling the December 1989 revolution. And then nationalism takes part in this discussion in the streets with different messages. For example, for the union with the Republic of Moldova. The Romanian leaders are the first to be tackled by the streets, and you have everybody. Most importantly, Ceausescu. In fact, Ceausescu is the first one to appear on the streets because it was the work of a contemporary artist who did "I'll Be Back." And so you have Ceausescu, who is still there. But then all the others are also there. So you have Iohannis, Cioloș, the current prime minister, and former. This is always what happens with populism.
Also a t-shirt for Gigi with a lamp.
So different leaders that are important in this sense, and under different forms. So for example, for the Socialist Party, a Mickey Mouse seems to be a reference because it's also Iliescu, which is a very early stencil, and Ponta, who are represented in this way. But also the former president Băsescu. So the political leaders are important on the street, but also the memory of the past comes along, and more there is this nostalgia for communism. And at the same time, and increasingly in the last year, I would say, there are more and more representations of this pro-right-wing movement, the new right, which is tolerated, and which also uses this form of political propaganda. So there is this détournement, this transformation of a means of contestation of power, which is taken over by the parties themselves and by companies. And so you have this means of attacking power, which is taken over by all sorts of powers. And other forms of contestation that are not erased and that continue to exist on the street and to coexist in this competition of memories and representations I was telling you about. Other messages also. So pro the union with the Republic of Moldova, anti-politics has been more and more present in the last years. The Orthodox Church, and the commercial, which for me was the most difficult to see. It was by HBO, and it was the fountain at the University Square, which was colored in red. And this leads me to the last point I want to make, which concerns contemporary art interventions in the public space. In fact, before 1990, the Union of Visual Artists, which is the topic of my project, as Oana recalled, had a monopoly on the representation of the past through the production and placement of monuments in the Romanian public space. The Union safeguarded partially this role after 1990, but then there is this diversification of cultural actors that intervene in the public space because it is allowed nowadays and the Securitate is not there to interrupt it. And performance has been a means that contemporary artists have used to interrupt this logic of domination, of a unique perspective on this public space. Performance, which is understood as embodied behavior that privileges body over speech, presence over absence, and praxis over product. Performances, as Diane Taylor tells us, function as vital acts of transfer, transmitting social knowledge, memory, and a sense of identity through reiterated, twice-behaved behavior. And I have 3 examples. 2 concern notably the University Square. Dan Perzhovsky's monument, Historii Hysteria of 2007, Farid Fairuz with Landscape with National Habitus, Intervention on Great Background of 2008, and Alexandra Piric, If You Don't Want Us, We Want You of 2011. 2 of the performances, that of Perzhovsky and Farid Fairuz, were enacted and discuss the University Square in Bucharest, which became after 1990 the preferred place of protest, being called the kilometer zero of democracy. Also because in 1990, right after the transition to democracy, people came together peacefully to protest the new regime of Ion Iliescu, which you saw in the images as Mickey Mouse, taken over by the members of the Communist Party, deposed in 1989 after a popular revolt. Perzhovsky, in his work, recreated the miners' interventions in the square in 1990 to evict protesters by violently beating them. Perzhovsky reenacted during 1 week, in this way you can see there, through a living statue of a miner and a protester, the confrontation in 1990 as a possibility to open up a new, more appeased memory of the event. So you have reenactment through this form of the living statue that provokes, or hopefully provokes, a new relation to that event. And Farid Fairuz, in his intervention, Landscape with National Habitus, Intervention on Great Background, which was part of a broader exhibition called Kilometer Zero, Representation and Repetition of the University Square, curated by Raluca Voina. He recalls the occupation by protesters in 1990, who were thereafter, as I said, violently removed, being called by the Iliescu regime. The performers use yoga pads to lay on the ground in different poses, some of them using comforters. And for Fairuz, the intention was to short-circuit the sleepy gaze of passers-by and to interpolate them by showing the bodies as such on the ground in a place charged of recent memories, and despite the commercial intervention. Alexandra Piric's intervention relates directly to the memorial of the revolution, of the 1989 revolution, which exists in the Revolution Square today, and uses, again, the body as such of those people that were killed there as a way of recalling and at the same time provoking this reaction in a broader discussion that also includes anti-monuments and the monumentalization of the public space through this kind of examples. And the final example I would quote is that of a Roma artist, George Vasilescu, who in this work, which I have difficulties to translate, seen the debate between rob and sclav in Romanian, so I kept it in the Romanian title, so it would be The Slaves of God, 500 Years of Slavery, but in Romanians still tend to, and some of the Roma community tend to still use rob, which would be a different kind of word to use for this enslavement. It's a bigger debate. But what what remains is this intervention, which was also in the public space because it was projected, it was put also on the fence of the exhibition space in which this involvement of the Orthodox Church in the enslavement of the Roma was recalled by Vasilescu. I'm sorry to have taken more time than granted, but thank you for your attention.